To save his life, the alien king presented his unwanted daughter to the humans as a gift. Thalrex, the alien king of the Zarkarian Empire, stood on the balcony of his throne room, watching the chaotic battle unfold in the distance. His once great empire was on the brink of collapse. Ships filled with enemy soldiers fired relentlessly at his city, while the air was filled with the sounds of explosions and the crackle of laser fire. It was a hopeless situation, one that Thalrex had known was coming for years. His reign was about to end. His advisors had long warned him of the dangers of his arrogance, but Thalrex had ignored them. He had expanded his empire with no regard for diplomacy, crushing any opposition in his path. Now, the consequences of his actions had caught up with him. His enemies had joined forces, and they had proven themselves far too powerful to defeat. Thalrex had no allies left, except for one. His thoughts turned to his daughter, Princess Vyra. She had always been an unwanted presence in his life, a reminder of his past mistakes. He had never wanted her, and her existence had been a source of shame. Vyra was different, her appearance strikingly unlike any other member of the royal family. She had silver skin, eyes that gleamed a deep violet, and hair that shimmered like starlight. Her features were captivating, but they marked her as an outsider in the royal court. Her uniqueness, however, was not the only reason for her father's indifference. Vyra had been rebellious from the moment she could walk, and her actions often went against everything her father believed in. Thalrex had hoped that one day she would grow into the ruler he had envisioned for his empire, but as the years passed, it became clear that Vyra would never be that ruler. She had no interest in politics, no desire for power, and most importantly, no respect for her father. But now, as his empire crumbled around him, Thalrex found himself facing a terrible truth. He had no choice but to rely on Vyra. There was only one way to save his life and his empire. With the enemy forces closing in, Thalrex summoned his trusted advisor, a loyal servant named Varnak. The older alien bowed before the king, waiting for his command. Thalrex's voice was cold as he spoke. "Varnak, I need you to contact the humans. It's time to offer them my daughter." Varnak's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Your daughter, my king?" he asked cautiously. "She has no role to play in our war with the humans." Thalrex turned to face his advisor, his eyes dark with desperation. "She is a gift," he said. "The humans value power, and Vyra possesses power unlike any other. Her abilities, though unrefined, could turn the tide in their favor. I need them to see her as an asset. They will protect her, and in turn they will protect me." Varnak remained silent for a moment, weighing his options. It was a difficult decision, one that went against everything the Zarkarian Empire stood for. But Thalrex's plan was the only one that had any chance of success. "Very well, my king," Varnak said finally. "I will arrange the meeting." The human embassy was unlike anything Vyra had ever seen. The tall, gleaming buildings that housed the human leaders seemed both foreign and familiar to her. She had never been to Earth before, and the air tasted different here, more acidic, more alive. The bustling streets were filled with humans going about their business, completely unaware of the political intrigue that was about to unfold. Vyra's hands were bound, and she was escorted by a group of human soldiers. She didn't resist. What would be the point? Her father had made it clear that her only purpose in life was to be a tool for the Zarkarian Empire, and now she was a pawn in his last, desperate gamble for survival. Vyra could feel the weight of the king's decision hanging heavily upon her. She was nothing more than an object to be exchanged for his life. Her emotions were a tangled mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion. She had never been treated with the respect that someone of her status deserved. Vyra had spent most of her life in isolation, kept away from the royal court by her father's orders. She was an inconvenience, a failure in his eyes. But now, as the king sent her to the humans, she realized that her father had one final plan for her, one that would cost her everything. The humans were waiting for her in the grand meeting hall. As Vyra was led inside, she could see their faces, humans of all shapes and sizes, some tall and muscular, others short and thin. They all stared at her with wide eyes, clearly fascinated by her appearance. But there was no warmth in their gazes, no kindness. She was just another oddity, another alien specimen to be examined. The human commander, a man named Isaac Ford, stood at the front of the room. His uniform was neat, his posture rigid, and his expression unreadable. Vyra's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. He seemed different from the others, more focused, more calculating. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than the others, and she could feel the weight of his scrutiny. He was sizing her up, trying to figure out her worth. "You are Princess Vyra, correct?" Commander Ford's voice was firm but not unkind. Vyra nodded, though she wasn't sure why she bothered. It wasn't as if anyone truly cared who she was. She was a tool, a means to an end. That was all. "We've been informed that you possess unique abilities," Ford continued, his gaze never leaving her. "Abilities that could help us in our struggle against the alien forces threatening Earth. Is that true?" Vyra's lip curled slightly. "What does it matter?" she asked bitterly. "My father gave me to you like some kind of gift. What you do with me is your business, not mine." Ford raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her frankness, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded to one of his aides, who stepped forward with a small device in hand. "We're going to test your abilities," Ford said, his tone serious. "If they are what we've been told, we may be able to use them to our advantage." Vyra's eyes flashed with defiance, but she didn't move. She had no choice. She would do as they asked, just as she always had. But inside, a fire burned, a fire that would one day break free. As the tests began, Vyra's mind wandered back to her father. She had never once felt love for him, and now she realized that she never would. He had sold her like a piece of property, all in the name of his own survival. Vyra was nothing more than a tool to him, and she would remain so until the very end. But something inside her stirred as she thought about the humans, particularly Commander Ford. There was something different about him, a quiet strength that called to her. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't all like her father. Maybe they could see her for what she truly was. As the tests concluded, Vyra stood alone in the room, her heart pounding. The humans had seen her power and they seemed impressed. But Vyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was still just a pawn, a piece on a board far bigger than her. She had been given to the humans by her father, but now she would have to decide what kind of future she wanted to create. Would she remain a tool for others to use, or would she fight for herself? And as the first rays of Earth's sun filtered through the windows, Vyra knew one thing. The path ahead would not be easy, but she would walk it, no matter the cost. Vyra spent the first few days in the human embassy trying to understand her new reality. It was strange, walking through the sterile white halls of the facility, the strange noises of this human world echoing around her. The walls were lined with unfamiliar technology, screens flashing with data she didn't care to learn. Everything about Earth felt foreign to her, from the food to the air, to the way the humans moved. Their world was a far cry from the cold, disciplined life she had led under her father's rule. She had been told that her powers were valuable, but no one had explained why they would be. They had shown her in various tests how she could manipulate energy, how she could alter small objects with a thought. But none of it made sense to her. Her abilities had always been part of her alien heritage, something she could never control fully, and something that her father had always deemed a nuisance. Now these humans, these strange creatures who barely understood their own technology, wanted to use her power to save their world. Each day, she was led to a new part of the embassy, each more clinical and isolating than the last. Soldiers and scientists came to study her, to test her abilities, but no one treated her as a person. They were all so fascinated by her powers that they seemed to forget she was standing right in front of them. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment. They wanted something from her, and she wanted nothing to do with any of them. One evening, as she sat in a small, sparsely furnished room, staring out of a window that overlooked the human city, Vyra thought about the conversation she'd had with Commander Isaac Ford the day before. He was different from the others. He didn't look at her like she was just some tool, but he hadn't exactly treated her with kindness either. He had spoken to her like a soldier under his command, giving orders, offering no warmth. Vyra had expected that. She had expected to be nothing more than an object to be studied. But Ford's eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, lingered on her as if he saw something more. Perhaps he saw the power she held inside. She didn't know if she could trust him. But for the first time since she had arrived on Earth, she didn't feel entirely alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. A soldier stepped in, his face blank. "The commander will see you now, princess." Vyra didn't respond right away. She was tired of being summoned like a child, her movements dictated by the humans around her. But she stood up, moving toward the door. She didn't have a choice. She had been brought here as a gift, as a tool, and there was nothing she could do to change that now. All she could do was play their game, wait, and see what would come of it. The room where Ford was waiting for her was simple but not unwelcoming. The walls were lined with technology, but it felt warmer here, almost like a command center with a large desk and a large window overlooking the city below. Ford was seated behind the desk, studying a screen, but when she entered, he looked up. "Vyra," he said, his voice steady. "Please have a seat." Vyra hesitated. She wasn't used to being invited to sit. It felt strange. But she took a chair not because she wanted to, but because she didn't see the point of refusing. She didn't belong here. She had no control over her situation. "I assume you've been briefed on our current situation," Ford began, his eyes never leaving hers. "The alien forces that threaten Earth are relentless, and we are losing the war, but you're our last hope." Vyra clenched her fists in her lap, fighting the urge to lash out. "I'm not here to be your weapon," she said, her voice sharp, betraying the anger she had been keeping inside. "I didn't come to this planet to fight your war. I didn't come to be a soldier." Ford's expression softened for a brief moment. "I understand that. But whether you like it or not, you're part of this now. Your abilities are our only chance. We need you, Vyra. We can't afford to waste time." Vyra's anger flared. "I'm not some tool to be used," she snapped. "Your people may think of me that way, but I'm not going to let you control me." There was silence in the room, the tension thick between them. Ford didn't respond right away, but Vyra could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was studying her just like all the others. He didn't see her as a person. He saw a solution, an answer to his problems. Finally, Ford spoke again, his tone calm. "I'm not asking you to fight our battles for us, but we need your help. The enemy's forces are unlike anything we've ever seen, and their weapons are more advanced than anything we've developed. We're losing ground. You may not want to fight, but your abilities are our only hope to survive." Vyra looked away, her gaze fixed on the window. She didn't want to help them. She didn't want to be part of this war, but a part of her understood that she had no choice. The humans were desperate, and so was she. She was stuck in this world, surrounded by enemies and unfamiliar faces, with nothing but her powers to protect her. But those powers came at a price. She had never been able to control them, never been able to predict what they would do. And using them could drain her life force, could leave her weak and vulnerable. "I won't be your weapon," Vyra said, her voice firm, "but I'll help you if it means I can leave this place. I want my freedom." Ford leaned back in his chair, studying her intently. For a moment, Vyra thought he might press her further, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, a look of understanding in his eyes. "I can't promise you freedom," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'll do everything I can to help you. I'm not your enemy, Vyra. And I don't want to control you. I only want to survive." Vyra looked at him for a long moment, unsure of what to believe. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone here. But for the first time since her arrival on Earth, she saw a glimmer of something, an understanding, a shared desire to survive. Maybe it was worth trying just to see where it led. "Fine," she said, standing up. "I'll help you, but understand this. If I do this, it's on my terms. I won't be your pawn." Ford stood up too, his expression hardening slightly. "Agreed." Vyra turned to leave, but then she paused. "One more thing," she said, glancing back at him. "You'd better keep your word. I don't trust anyone here, not you, not your people. But if you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it." Ford didn't flinch. "You have my word, Vyra. We'll work together. For now, that's enough." Vyra nodded, her heart still heavy with uncertainty. She didn't know if she could trust him. She didn't know if she could trust anyone. But as she stepped out of the room, she felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was something more. And no matter what happened, she would fight to keep that freedom. Vyra woke to the dull hum of machinery outside her room, a sound that had become all too familiar. Earth had a rhythm to it, one that she had never understood, yet she couldn't seem to escape. She had spent weeks inside the embassy, her time divided between exercises designed to hone her powers and conversations with the humans who were eager to use her. Most of them were polite, formal even, but it was clear that their interest in her wasn't based on kindness. They saw her as a tool, nothing more, nothing less. The tests had become routine. The human scientists tried to study her abilities, attempting to figure out how they worked, how they could be harnessed to help them in their war. The experiments weren't painful, but they were invasive. They pushed her to use her power in ways that felt unnatural, forcing her to manipulate energy, bend it to their will. At first, she had resisted, but as time passed, she began to realize that resistance wasn't an option. They were determined to use her abilities no matter what. Her only choice was to comply. There were moments, brief as they were, when she felt something stir within her, something that wasn't just anger or frustration. She had been alone for so long, isolated from everyone, even her father. And now, with the humans, she was needed. In their eyes, she was the key to their survival. For the first time in her life, Vira felt like she had a purpose. But that purpose came at a cost, and it wasn't one she was entirely comfortable with. She hadn't seen much of Commander Isaac Ford in the past few days. He had been busy with the military operations, and she had been left to her own devices. It was strange how her thoughts always seemed to drift back to him. She couldn't decide if she resented him or if she felt something else entirely. He had treated her with a kind of respect, yes, but it was always tempered with authority. He was a soldier and soldiers gave orders. They didn't ask questions. And yet there was something different about him. He wasn't like the others. That afternoon, as she sat in the small room provided to her, Vira found herself staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The humans had their own way of life, complicated, but somehow more vibrant than the sterile existence she had known on Zarkaria. There were no battles here, no constant power struggles. At least that's what she thought. She knew Earth had its own problems, but from the little she had seen, the humans seemed to find a way to live without constantly destroying each other. It was something she found difficult to understand. Her people, the Zarkarians, had always been about conquest and control. To her, the humans were strange, weak even, yet there was a fire within them that she hadn't expected. Vira was snapped out of her thoughts when a soft knock echoed through the door. She turned her head toward it, her senses sharp. The door opened slightly and a familiar face appeared. "Commander Ford is requesting your presence," the soldier said, his voice neutral. Vira nodded without a word. She had been summoned before, but each time it felt different. Ford was the only one who treated her like an equal, even if he still regarded her with a certain level of authority. She didn't know what to expect this time, but she followed the soldier down the narrow corridor, her footsteps echoing against the cold walls. When she entered Ford's office, he was standing by a large map, his hands resting on the table as he studied it intently. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the various screens that lined the walls. The atmosphere felt heavy, like something important was about to happen. "Vira," Ford said, not turning to face her immediately, "I'm glad you came." Vira stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady, though she couldn't quite hide the suspicion in her tone. Ford finally turned to look at her, his expression serious. "We've received new intelligence," he said. "The alien forces are planning a full-scale assault. They've identified key human strongholds, and we need to prepare. We believe your abilities could turn the tide, but I need to know if you're ready." Vira raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "Ready for what?" "To be used as a weapon?" Her voice was calm, but there was a bitter edge to it. Ford didn't flinch. "We need your help, Vira. We've seen what you can do, and I'm not going to lie to you. You're our best chance, but I need to know that you're fully committed to this. We can't afford any hesitation." Vira's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't what she had imagined when she first arrived on Earth. She had thought she would be a pawn, yes, but never this much of a liability. She hadn't known how much power she truly held, how much control over their fate rested in her hands. The weight of that realization was heavy. She had never been asked to be responsible for anything before, let alone the lives of entire planets. "I don't want to be a weapon," she said slowly, her eyes locking onto Ford's, "but I don't want to watch you all die either." Ford nodded, understanding the unspoken truth between them. "We're all soldiers in this war, Vira. Whether we like it or not, we all have our part to play. I'm asking you to fight to help us fight back. The enemy won't stop unless we do something drastic." Vira took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She could feel the stirring of something inside her, a need to prove herself, to finally take control of her own destiny. This was her chance, not just to survive, but to make a difference. But the fear was still there, gnawing at her. What if using her power drained her? What if it took everything from her? "I'll help you," she said quietly, the words feeling heavier than she expected. "But I need to know more. I need to understand what's at stake. I can't just blindly follow orders." Ford smiled, a rare expression that softened his normally stern face. "I understand, and I'll make sure you have everything you need, But right now, the most important thing is that we prepare. The war won't wait for us. Vira nodded, her decision made. She didn't know what would come next or how much she could truly help, but she was no longer just the unwanted daughter. She was more than that. She was something the humans needed, and she would make sure they didn't forget it. That night, as Vira lay in her bed, she couldn't help but replay her conversation with Ford over and over in her mind. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she didn't feel completely alone. Ford had given her something she hadn't expected: trust. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this war than just survival. Maybe there was a chance for something greater. But she knew one thing for sure: she would never be anyone's weapon again. If she was going to fight, it would be on her own terms. And as the first rays of morning light crept through her window, Vira knew that the battle ahead would define who she was. No longer the unwanted daughter, no longer just a tool. She would fight to protect herself, and to protect those who believed in her. The days leading up to the battle felt like a blur to Vira. She had spent hours in training, learning how to control her powers under the watchful eye of the human military, but each day she felt the weight of the coming war pressing down on her. The more she practiced, the more she realized the true cost of using her abilities. Every time she called upon the energy that flowed through her, it left a mark on her body, a fatigue she couldn't shake. The humans believed she was their savior, their key to victory, but she knew that the power they so desperately sought could also destroy her. Commander Ford had been with her during many of the training sessions. He never pushed her too hard, always observing quietly, his sharp eyes never leaving her. There was a part of Vira that appreciated his restraint. He didn't treat her like a tool, not entirely. But there was still the undeniable fact that, to the humans, she was nothing more than a weapon. They would use her, drain her, and once her usefulness was gone, they would discard her, just as her father had done. The base where they were stationed was surrounded by a forest of steel. Massive walls, guarded checkpoints, and surveillance drones made it impossible to escape. Vira had been given a small room to herself, one that overlooked the vast expanse of human infrastructure below. The outside world seemed so distant, so unreachable from the walls of this place. She sometimes wondered if she would ever see the stars again. It was early morning when Ford appeared at her door, his face grim as he stepped inside. "We've received new information," he said without preamble. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that caught Vira's attention. "Tell me," she replied, her heart already racing. She had learned to trust his directness, even if it wasn't always comforting. "The alien forces are closer than we thought. They're not just coming for Earth, they're coming for you. They know you're here, Vira, and they've changed their tactics. They're targeting you specifically. The stakes have never been higher." Vira felt a chill creep up her spine. "Why, what do they want with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fear she had been trying to suppress now surged within her. Ford's gaze softened for a moment, but he didn't look away. "We're not entirely sure, but we believe your father has made a move. He's sending an elite force to retrieve you alive. He wants you back." Vira clenched her fists. The idea of returning to her father, of being a pawn in his game again, filled her with disgust, but she knew she had little choice. If the enemy forces came, they would destroy everything in their path to get to her. "So what now?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Ford met her gaze, his eyes hardening. "We fight. We use everything you have. The plan is simple. We strike first, hit them before they get a chance to surround us. We have one shot at this, Vira. If we fail, the entire human race could be wiped out." The pressure of the moment settled in Vira's chest. She had no choice but to go along with it. Her powers, her life, everything was riding on her ability to stop the alien forces. She could feel the energy within her, a vast, unshaped potential that was barely contained. But each time she tapped into it, she could feel the toll it took on her. It wasn't just physical. It was like a part of her was being drained with every use, slowly but surely. "How much longer do I have?" Vira asked, her voice barely audible. "Before the energy takes too much from me?" Ford's expression softened, but there was a steely resolve behind it. "I can't answer that, but we have to use your abilities as much as we can while we can. The war is coming, Vira, and when it does, you'll need to be ready." She nodded, though the weight of it all made her heart heavy. She wasn't ready. She didn't know if she ever would be. But she had no choice now. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Vira was briefed on the enemy's movements, on the tactics they expected to use, and the resources they had. It was all too much to process at once. She was trained to fight, but she had never been trained to fight for something bigger than herself. She had always been a tool, a weapon to be used for someone else's gain. Now, for the first time in her life, she was asked to choose, to fight for humanity, for herself, or to simply let everything fall apart. The soldiers moved through the base like a well-oiled machine, preparing for the inevitable attack. Vira watched them, each one focused on their mission, determined to protect what they had. But even with all the weapons at their disposal, they knew it wouldn't be enough without her help. Ford was everywhere, leading the charge, giving orders, keeping everything running smoothly. His presence was reassuring, but it also reminded Vira of how little control she had in this situation. She had no say in what happened next. Her role had been decided for her. Later that evening, after the last of the preparations were complete, Vira stood alone in the training room. The hum of energy filled the air as she focused her mind, reaching out to the power within her. She could feel it swirling just beneath the surface, ready to be unleashed. She had to be careful. She had learned that the hard way. Every time she used it, it took something from her. But what choice did she have? As she let the energy flow through her, she felt the familiar surge, the rush of power. The air around her crackled, the room glowing with the intensity of her abilities. For a brief moment, she felt invincible. But the feeling quickly faded, replaced by the sharp exhaustion that always followed. She staggered slightly, catching herself on the edge of the table. It was getting harder to control, harder to keep up the facade of strength. "Are you okay?" a voice called from the doorway. Vira turned to see Ford standing there, his expression concerned but unreadable. "I'm fine," she said, her voice more strained than she intended. "I just need to be ready for what's coming." Ford didn't move, but his gaze softened as he studied her. "Vira, you don't have to do this alone. We're all in this together." She looked away, not trusting herself to speak. She didn't want to rely on anyone, not again, not after everything she had been through. She had been alone for so long. But the humans, Ford especially, were making her question everything she had ever believed. "I don't need anyone," she muttered under her breath. But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. Ford took a step closer, his voice gentle. "I know it's hard. But you're not alone, not anymore." Vira didn't respond. She couldn't. The words felt hollow, and she didn't know how to process them. There was too much at stake, too much fear tangled with the hope of survival. But Ford's presence, his quiet confidence, was a reminder that there was more to life than what she had known before. The battle was coming, and she had no choice but to face it head-on. She would give everything she had to stop it, even if it meant losing herself in the process. As she left the training room and headed toward the command center, her mind was focused, her resolve solid. There was no turning back now. The war was here, and so was she. Vira was no longer just the unwanted daughter. She was someone who could change the course of history. And she would fight to ensure that the humans she had come to care for didn't pay the price for her past. The day of the battle had arrived. Vira stood at the command center, her hands trembling as she adjusted the straps of her uniform. The weight of the responsibility settled heavy on her shoulders, more pressing than the exhaustion that clung to her body. The energy within her pulsed, a constant hum that she had grown used to, but it felt different now, more urgent, more desperate. She had trained for this, but nothing could truly prepare her for what lay ahead. The human forces had gathered, their weapons ready, their plans set in motion, but everything depended on her. She had been told time and time again that her abilities were their greatest asset, that without her, Earth stood little chance against the alien forces. It was a role she hadn't chosen, but it was the role she now had to play, and there was no turning back. Vira had been briefed on the enemy's movements. The Zarkarians, led by her father, were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. Their forces were vast, their weapons powerful, but the humans had something her father didn't: unity. They had each other. And for better or worse, they had Vira. Commander Isaac Ford was busy coordinating the defense, his eyes flicking between screens as he barked orders. He barely looked up when Vira entered the room, but she could see the tension in his posture. He was focused, as always, but there was something different in the air today. The stakes had never been this high. Vira approached him, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "What's the plan?" Ford glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We've set up a perimeter. We're going to hit them hard and fast before they can get too close. Once they breach our outer defenses, we fall back to the second line. You'll be at the front, Vira. We need your energy to disable their weapons." Vira nodded, though a pit formed in her stomach. She had never been on the front lines before. She had never had to use her power to fight a battle like this. It was one thing to test her abilities in a controlled environment, but it was another thing entirely to use them in the chaos of war. "I understand," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She couldn't afford to show weakness now, not with everything at stake. Ford's eyes softened for a moment, and for the briefest of moments she saw something in him, something that wasn't just about strategy or survival. He was concerned, maybe even worried, but his face quickly hardened again and he turned away. "Let's get to it then." "The first wave should be here in 30 minutes, he said, his voice steady. "We'll hold them off as long as we can." Vira turned to leave, but Ford's voice stopped her. "Vira!" She turned back to him, her gaze meeting his. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then with a quiet intensity, Ford said, "Stay alive." Vira nodded, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything in return. She wasn't sure she could promise that. She didn't know if she could survive this battle. She didn't know if she could survive what using her powers might do to her. The battle began with a deafening roar, the ground shaking as the first wave of Zarkarian forces slammed into the human defenses. Vira was at the front, her heart pounding as she prepared to unleash the energy that had been building within her. Her hands tingled, a sharp sensation that made her feel alive but also afraid. She had never used this much power before. She didn't know what would happen if she did. The Zarkarians were fierce, their weapons designed to tear through anything in their path, but Vira was ready. She stepped forward, focusing on the target, an enemy tank that had breached the outer defenses. The humans were already engaged, their firepower slamming into the alien forces, but they needed her. They needed her to stop the tanks, to take out their heavy artillery. She raised her hands, her body trembling as the energy swirled around her. The air hummed with the power she was about to unleash, and for a split second, she felt invincible. The tank ahead of her started to glow, its outer shell pulsing with energy as Vira focused all her strength on it. She pushed forward, channeling everything she had into the blast. The explosion was deafening. The tank crumpled before her, its metal twisted and melted under the force of the energy she had just released. Vira stumbled back, gasping for breath. The energy had drained her more than she had anticipated. It was as if the very life force inside her had been pulled out, leaving her weak and dizzy. But there was no time to rest. The enemy was relentless. Another wave of soldiers came charging at them, and Vira had to act again. She couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Her next attack was more calculated. She targeted the enemy's communications array, a key piece of their technology that could turn the tide of the battle. The blast she sent out was smaller, but more precise, hitting the target dead on. The array exploded in a burst of light, leaving the enemy scrambling. The humans cheered as the enemy's communication systems went down, but Vira barely heard them. She was already sinking into exhaustion, her body screaming at her to stop. She had to keep going. The battle raged on for hours. Vira lost track of time as she continued to use her powers, her strength draining with each blast. She could feel herself weakening, but she couldn't afford to stop. The Zarkarians were closing in, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. They were coming for her, and the humans were depending on her to keep them safe. But Vira could feel the toll her powers were taking on her. Each time she used them, she felt more and more like she was fading away. The energy that had once felt like a part of her now felt like a parasite, draining her from the inside out. It was getting harder to concentrate, harder to focus. She had to fight through the pain, through the overwhelming exhaustion. She couldn't give in now. And then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, the Zarkarian forces breached the final line of defense. The humans began to fall back, retreating to their last stronghold. Vira was too weak to fight them off, too drained to stop them. She had given everything she had, but it still wasn't enough. "Vira!" Ford's voice cut through the chaos. She turned, her vision blurred as she saw him moving toward her, pushing through the chaos. "We have to fall back, it's over." Vira didn't respond. She couldn't. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, her body no longer able to support her. Ford reached her in seconds, pulling her into his arms. "Stay with me, Vira, please," he said, his voice full of urgency. But Vira knew it was too late. She had given everything she had, and there was nothing left. The battle was lost. And then, just as she felt the darkness creeping in, she felt something different, something warm, something real. Ford was holding her, his presence steady and comforting. Despite everything, despite the loss, she wasn't alone. She had fought for something, even if it hadn't been enough. The darkness swallowed her then, but she wasn't afraid. She had done what she could, and in that moment she knew that she had found something more than just survival. She had found a purpose, and in the end, that was all she had ever wanted.